Nobody named it the Silk Road while people were actually using it. That name came later, much later, coined by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, more than 1,000 years after the greatest period of the road's activity had already passed. The people who actually walked it, rode it, sweated across it, preyed on it, traded along it, and died somewhere in its vast and merciless middle sections did not call it anything so romantic or so unified. They called the particular stretch they knew by local names. They knew their section, the mountain pass they used, the oasis town where they rested, the desert they had to survive, and they knew the merchants and guides and soldiers and priests who shared that stretch with them. The idea that all of these separate, dangerous, beautiful, terrible sections formed a single connected system linking the Chinese imperial court in the east to the Mediterranean world in the west was a concept that belonged to geographers and historians looking backward, not to the camel drivers and silk merchants and Buddhist monks and plague-carrying rats who were the actual authors of one of the greatest stories in human history. But the name stuck. And the name is right, in the way that good names are right, not perfectly accurate in every detail, but true to the essential spirit of what it is describing. Because silk was at the heart of it. Silk was the product that made the whole enormous, dangerous, improbable enterprise worthwhile. Silk was the reason a merchant in the city of Chang'an would load his goods onto a camel, say goodbye to his family, and walk into the Gobi Desert knowing that he might never walk out of it again. To understand why silk had that power, you have to understand what silk was to the ancient world. Silk is produced by the silkworm, the caterpillar of the Bombyx mori moth, which spins a cocoon of continuous protein filament that can be unwound and woven into a fabric of extraordinary qualities. It is light and strong. It drapes with a fluid elegance that no other fabric matches. It catches light in a way that makes it seem to glow from within. It is warm in winter and cool in summer. It is comfortable against the skin in a way that wool and linen, the fabrics available to most of the ancient world, simply are not. And it is, crucially, difficult to produce, requiring the cultivation of mulberry trees to feed the silkworms, the careful management of the silkworms through their life cycle, the delicate unwinding of the cocoons before the emerging moth can break the filament, and the skilled weaving of the unwound thread into fabric. The entire process requires knowledge, patience, equipment, and labor that made silk genuinely, justifiably expensive. But the ancient Chinese had another advantage beyond their mastery of silk production. For centuries, scholars debate exactly how long, but certainly for most of the period before the 2nd century BC, China maintained a monopoly on silk. Not just a commercial monopoly or a market advantage. An actual, carefully guarded, legally enforced state secret. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was death. The knowledge of how silk was made, that it came from a worm, that the worm fed on mulberry leaves, that the cocoon could be unwound, was one of the most jealously protected industrial secrets in the ancient world. The rest of the world could buy Chinese silk, could wear it and admire it and pay extraordinary prices for it. But they could not make it. They did not even know, for centuries, where it came from. In the Roman Empire, silk was worth its weight in gold. Literally, the exchange rate between silk and gold was approximately 1-to-1 by weight at certain points in Roman history. Roman senators debated whether the wearing of silk by men should be prohibited as immoral and effeminate luxury. Roman moralists complained about the quantities of Roman gold flowing eastward in exchange for Chinese fabric. And yet the demand never diminished. Emperors wore silk. Aristocrats wore silk. The most powerful people in the most powerful empire in the Western world wanted Chinese silk, and they were willing to pay whatever it cost to get it. That desire, and the desire of Chinese merchants to satisfy it at enormous profit, was the engine that drove the Silk Road into existence. The man most often credited with opening the eastern end of the Silk Road is a Chinese imperial envoy named Zhong Qian, and his story is one of the most extraordinary personal adventures in the entire history of exploration and diplomacy. Zhong Qian was not a merchant or a geographer. He was a court official in the service of the Han Emperor Wu, who came to the throne in 141 BC and proved to be one of the most ambitious and consequential rulers in Chinese history. Emperor Wu's great strategic problem in the early years of his reign was the Xiongnu, the powerful nomadic confederation of the steppes north and west of China that had been raiding Chinese territory, extracting tribute, and posing a persistent military threat that his predecessors had dealt with primarily through appeasement and diplomacy. Emperor Wu wanted a different approach. He wanted to fight the Xiongnu. And to fight them effectively, he believed he needed allies. Specifically, he had heard reports of a powerful people called the Yuezhi who had been driven westward by the Xiongnu and who might be willing to form a military alliance against their mutual enemy. In 139 BC, he sent Zhong Qian westward with a small party to find the Yuezhi and negotiate this alliance. What happened next was not what anyone planned. Zhong Qian and his party were captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately after leaving Chinese territory. He was not killed. The Xiongnu, recognizing his official status, held him as a prisoner and eventually integrated him somewhat into their society. He was given a Xiongnu wife. He lived among them for 10 years. 10 years of captivity on the steppes, far from home, in a culture utterly unlike his own. And yet when the opportunity came, when the surveillance over him relaxed enough that escape became possible, he took it. He gathered his party, including his Xiongnu wife, and fled westward, continuing the mission that had been interrupted a decade earlier. He eventually found the Yuezhi, by now settled comfortably in the rich lands of Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan, and no longer particularly interested in military adventures against the Xiongnu who had driven them there. The alliance Zhong Qian had been sent to negotiate never happened. His mission, in its stated diplomatic purpose, was a failure. But Zhong Qian, being an intelligent and observant man, did not return to China with nothing. He returned with something far more valuable than a military treaty. He returned with knowledge. He had seen the Western world, or a significant portion of it. He had traveled through the lands that would become the middle sections of the Silk Road. He had seen the horses of Fergana, the magnificent large horses that Chinese military strategists would later call heavenly horses and that Emperor Wu would wage expensive wars to acquire for his cavalry. He had seen the goods and the products and the civilizations of Central Asia, Persia, and the edges of the known world. And he had brought back reports of lands even further west, of a great civilization called Darqin that scholars believe referred to the Roman Empire, which Chinese sources described with a mixture of admiration and fascination that mirrors almost exactly the way Roman sources described China. When Zhong Qian returned to the Han court in 125 BC, after a second capture by the Xiongnu on his return journey and another period of captivity before escaping again, he brought his reports to Emperor Wu and changed Chinese foreign policy permanently. Emperor Wu was fascinated. He sent Zhong Qian on a second mission, this time to the south and west, to explore additional routes and establish contacts with as many Western peoples as possible. And when Zhong Qian eventually died, having spent most of his adult life on diplomatic missions to worlds that most Chinese people would never see, he left behind something that outlasted all his personal adventures: the knowledge, the contacts, and the demonstrated possibility of regular communication and trade between China and the Western world. The road that gradually developed from these beginnings was not a road in any simple, physical sense. It was a network, a vast, complex, constantly shifting network of routes that adapted to political conditions, seasonal changes, the presence or absence of water, the rise and fall of the powers that controlled particular sections, and the practical preferences of the merchants and travelers who actually used it. In its broadest definition, the Silk Road network stretched more than 7,000 miles from the imperial Chinese capital of Chang'an in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in the west. It crossed the Gobi Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. It traversed the Taklamakan Desert, whose name in the Yugur language means something along the lines of "you go in but you don't come out." It climbed through the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where passes sat at altitudes above 4,000 meters where altitude sickness and bitter cold killed the unprepared. It crossed the great steppes of Central Asia and the plateaus of Persia and the mountains of Anatolia before finally reaching the Mediterranean ports where goods could be loaded onto ships and carried to Rome and Alexandria and Constantinople. No single merchant traveled the entire route. The reality of Silk Road trade was a relay system, goods moving from hand to hand, each merchant carrying them through the section they knew, selling them to the next merchant at the great oasis trading towns that punctuated the route like beads on a string. Dunhuang, at the edge of the Chinese world. Kasha, at the foot of the Pamirs. Samarkand and Bukhara, in the rich heart of Central Asia. Merv, Nishapur, Ctesiphon along the Persian routes. Each of these cities was not just a resting place but a living, breathing, cosmopolitan hub where merchants from a dozen different cultures met and traded and argued and rested and worshipped and exchanged not just goods but languages, religions, technologies, diseases, and ideas. And the goods that moved along the route were far more varied than the name Silk Road suggests. Yes, silk moved westward from China in enormous quantities. Bolts of plain silk, elaborate embroidered silk, raw silk thread, silk garments of every description. But alongside the silk travelled porcelain, which the Western world could not make and could not get enough of. Tea, which would eventually become the defining drink of half the world. Paper, one of China's most transformative contributions to global civilization, which moved westward along the Silk Road and reached the Islamic world in the 8th century and Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, eventually making possible the printing press and everything that followed from it. Cast iron technology. Gunpowder, in its early stages, before it was weaponized, and the fireworks made from it. And the compass, the navigational technology that would eventually help make the sea routes that partially replaced the land roads possible. Moving eastward along the same routes came goods equally precious to the Chinese court and the Chinese population. Glass, which China did not produce in the same quality or quantity as the Roman and later Islamic world, arrived in China as a luxury product of high value and great fascination. Gold and silver. Wool and linen textiles. Horses, the great military prize that Emperor Wu had originally sought and continued to seek throughout his reign. Cotton, which eventually became one of the most important textile crops in Chinese history. Spices from India and Southeast Asia, carried by sea to Persian Gulf ports and then overland through the Silk Road network. Lapis lazuli, the brilliant blue stone from the mines of Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan, that colored the robes of Byzantine emperors and the illuminations of medieval manuscripts and the paintings of the Renaissance. But the movement of goods, as extraordinary as it was perhaps the least important thing that traveled the Silk Road. The most transformative cargo the road carried was invisible. It was ideas. Religions. Ways of thinking about the world, about the divine, about the relationship between human beings and the cosmos, about medicine, about mathematics, about music, about art. The Silk Road was the greatest transmission belt for ideas and beliefs in the pre-modern world, and the civilizations it touched were changed by that transmission in ways so deep and so fundamental that the effects are still visible everywhere in the world today. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road from its birthplace in northern India westward into Central Asia and then eastward into China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, becoming one of the great world religions precisely because the Silk Road gave it a highway across the most densely populated part of the world. The cave temples of Dunhuang, carved into the cliffs at the western edge of the Chinese world and filled with Buddhist paintings and sculptures by generations of pilgrims and monks and artists over nearly 1,000 years, stand today as perhaps the most beautiful physical record of what the Silk Road meant for the transmission of spiritual ideas. A place where Chinese and Indian and Central Asian and Persian artistic traditions mixed and merged and produced something entirely new and entirely magnificent. Christianity traveled the Silk Road too, in forms that modern Western Christians would barely recognize. The Nestorian Christians, expelled from the Byzantine Empire as heretics in the 5th century, moved eastward along the trade routes and established thriving Christian communities in Persia, Central Asia, India, and eventually China, where beautiful stone stele erected in the Tang dynasty capital in 781 AD records in both Chinese and Syriac script the arrival of the luminous religion from the West. Islam, after its explosive emergence in the 7th century, spread with remarkable speed along the Silk Road network, carried by Arab merchants and missionaries and later by the Turkic peoples who converted and carried it further eastward and westward, until it had become the dominant religion of the great Central Asian cities that were the heart of the Silk Road system. The Silk Road reached its greatest flowering in the 7th and 8th centuries, during the Tang dynasty in China and the early Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world. A period when both great empires were at their most cosmopolitan, most curious, and most open to the goods and ideas arriving from distant places. The Tang capital of Chang'an, modern Lebanon, was at this period the largest city in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million people, and it was a city of extraordinary cultural diversity. Foreign merchants from Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Arab world lived in designated quarters of the city. Foreign religions had their temples and mosques and churches and Zoroastrian fire temples. Foreign music was fashionable at the Tang court. Foreign fashions influenced Chinese dress and art. The Tang capital was not just a Chinese city that happened to receive some foreign visitors. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan place, a meeting point of civilizations, a living embodiment of what the Silk Road made possible when it was functioning at its best. The decline of the Silk Road as the dominant channel of East-West exchange was gradual and had multiple causes. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century brought both a brief golden age of Silk Road travel, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, which made it temporarily safer to cross the entire Eurasian landmass than it had been for centuries, allowing travelers like Marco Polo to make their famous journeys, and ultimately a profound disruption of the settled agricultural and commercial civilizations on which the road depended. The Black Death, which traveled the Silk Road in the mid-14th century with devastating efficiency, carried by the fleas of the rats that infested the caravans and the storehouses of the oasis cities, killed somewhere between a third and half the population of Eurasia and shattered the commercial networks that sustained the road for decades. The final blow came not from disease or conquest but from navigation. The Portuguese development of sea routes around Africa to India and Asia in the late 15th and early 16th centuries offered a cheaper, faster, and more reliable alternative to the land routes that had always been dangerous, expensive, and dependent on the political stability of the many different powers whose territories they crossed. When Vasco da Gama arrived in India by sea in 1498, he was not just completing a remarkable voyage. He was announcing the beginning of the end of the Silk Road's primacy as the main channel of trade between East and West. The great caravans did not stop overnight. The oasis cities did not empty immediately. But the center of gravity of global trade shifted, gradually and then decisively, from the overland routes of Eurasia to the sea lanes that connected the world's oceans. And yet the Silk Road did not simply disappear from history when its commercial function was superseded. It left behind something permanent, a transformation of the world that could not be undone or reversed. The religions it had spread. The technologies it had transmitted. The agricultural products it had moved from one continent to another, permanently changing what people ate and how they farmed. The artistic traditions it had mixed and merged, creating new forms of beauty that could not have existed without the meeting of distant cultures. The languages that had spread along its routes. The cities it had built and enriched and made cosmopolitan. All of these things remained, woven into the fabric of civilization so thoroughly that most of us carry the influence of the Silk Road in our daily lives without ever knowing it. Every time you drink tea. Every time you wear cotton. Every time you look at a Buddhist sculpture or walk into a mosque or read a book printed on paper. Every time a rocket leaves the earth on the descendants of the gunpowder that Chinese alchemists accidentally invented. Every time a ship navigates by compass across an open ocean. The Silk Road is there, in the background, in the foundations, in the invisible transmission of ideas and goods and technologies that connected the human world across the centuries and made the modern civilization possible. No one named it while they were living it. No camel driver pushing through the Taklamakan desert called it the Silk Road. No monk carrying Buddhist sutras eastward through the Pamir passes gave it that name. No Persian merchant counting his profits in a Samarkand caravanserai thought of himself as part of something with a name grand enough for history books. They were just doing what human beings have always done. Moving. Trading. Talking. Passing things on. Carrying the world they knew into the world they did not know yet, and coming back changed by the encounter. That is the Silk Road. That is what it was. And in the deepest sense, in the sense of human connection across distance and difference and the patient accumulation of shared knowledge, it never really ended at all.